Hamadakiapi, this is Nick Estes. We're really excited to be joined today by a wonderful guest, Noelani Ahia, who is calling in from, I believe you're calling in from Maui. Can you just start by introducing yourself and talking about where you're calling in from?
Sure. Aloha mai kako o Noelani Ahia ko inoa no Wailuku mai au. I'm Noelani Ahia and I'm in Wailuku, Maui right now, which is just on the other side of Mauna Kahalavai, or the West Maui Mountains, where Lahaina is situated.
Thanks for that. And can you talk a little bit about Lahaina and why it is such a sort of hub, like a cultural hub and a place where there's such, embedded history for Kanaka Maoli people?
Absolutely. Lahaina, going back as far as we have documentation, which because of our chants that were passed down orally is thousands of years worth of mo'okuauhau, or genealogy, and mo'olelo, or stories about places that are significant and important to our people. And Lahaina is one of those places. Lahaina means the sweltering sun, but the original, one of the older names of Lahaina is Lahaina i ka malu ulu o lele, and it's the place of the sheltering sun that's shaded by the flying breadfruit. So breadfruit is ulu. It's a major staple for Kanaka Maoli diet. It's incredibly nutritious, and it's being used all over the world now to promote food sovereignty in underserved populations that don't have food sovereignty. So nutritionally, it's very important, but culturally, it's incredibly significant. And we have this mo'olelo, this story about one of our deities, Ku. And you have to understand, for us, our deities are elements of nature and elements of the cosmos that provide life, that allow us to live in a place and survive there. So we have this deity, Ku, and one of his many forms, he has 70 plus different faces, but one of his forms was as a husband whose family was in famine, and he sacrificed his life, and they planted him in the ground, and the ulu tree came out of it. And he made this sacrifice so that his family could eat, so that they could be abundant for time immemorial. So the ulu tree is very sacred to Lahaina, and pre-contact, there were ulu trees all over Lahaina. There was a big grove of ulu trees that shaded. In our hydrology cycle, of course, the more trees we have, the more water goes up, the more rain we have. And Lahaina was also a very abundant place for rain and water. There was referred to as the Venice of the Pacific, which, I'm not crazy about usually using Western terminology, but that imagery lets people know that there was water. It was not the dry, barren place that you find Lahaina to be today. So because of that water, in Hawaiian thinking, the word for fresh water is vai, and the word for wealth is vai vai. So if you have a lot of water, you have wealth, you have abundance. Basically, it means you can live there. So because of this abundance, there were a lot of food crops. Aside from ulu, we had our traditional kalo plant. And our kalo plant is also part of our one of our creation stories. We have many, but one of our creation stories where the first child was stillborn, and was planted into the ground. And out of that came the kalo plant, again, to feed the next generations. So we see this theme about feeding being very, very important in our culture, because no water, no life, no food, no life. These are all the things that allowed us to exist in the most remote location in the world for over 1,000 years. So when you have all of this abundance in one location, it's a place that would attract the highest of the high in terms of our monarchs and our ali'i. So it was a place that our ali'i chose to make the seat of their kingdom and of their rulership, for lack of a better word. But going back as early as the 15th century to one of our great ali'i, Pi'ilani, who many of our roads are named after. Our major road is Honua Pi'ilani in Lahaina, named after the great King Pi'ilani, or great ali'i. We didn't have kings back then, but his family was seated there. And there was a very, very sacred area in what's now considered Lahaina town called Mokuhinia, which was a wetland. Again, more water. and Moku'ula, which was an island situated in the middle of the wetland that folks often would take canoe or va'a to travel to. And some of our highest ali'i lived on Moku'ula, including all the way up to the kingdom period. It was actually the first capital of the kingdom of Hawaii when Kauikeaoli, Kamehameha III, penned the first constitution for the Hawaiian Kingdom, which was one of the prerequisites for allowing us into the League of Nations, to legitimize us by Western standards, which is, its own beauty and also problem in many, many ways. We can talk about that later. But it had what we call mana. Lahaina had mana. And mana is like a spiritual force. It's something that's palpable and tangible. It's something that we all have as human beings. But it's definitely something that exists in a place and in our aina. Aina means that which feeds. It's our land. And again, we go back to this theme of feeding, right? Because for people in the middle of the ocean, no food, no life. I mean, it's true for everybody, but we didn't have access as easily to other places to get food. So Lahaina, being this place of abundance, attracted our ali'i. And during the Pi'ilani Kingdom, Pi'ilani had a daughter who was born as what we call e'epa, which means sort of special, gifted, connected to the spirit, maybe a channel. Some people might see that as, but definitely very, very manaful. And when she passed away, she was deified. There are ceremonies that transmute a human person into either an elemental deity or a deity that takes the form of something physical. And in this case, she took the form of a mo'o. Now, mo'o are, some people would say lizards. Some people compare them to dragons, but they're very, very powerful. They oftentimes live in the water. They can traverse underground through the lava tubes. They can go from island to island if they want to. But Kiha Wahine was very, very special. Carried so much mana and so much kapu, or sacred rules around her, that Kamehameha I, who united all of the islands and made us a kingdom, he carried her with him on that journey because she was so high and so sacred, along with his war god Kukailimoku. So Kiha Wahine, being that deity of such a heightened stature and so much mana, is part of what makes Lahaina so incredibly important to our culture, because she's still with us and she's still speaking through her descendants. In fact, since this situation, many, many descendants have spoken about the dreams they're having, the visions they're having about the return of Kiha Wahine. Maybe even in some respects, the wrath of Kiha Wahine, because of what was done to her water systems, what was done to the cave systems and the karst systems that go underground, because of things like overdevelopment, theft of water, plantation, monocropping, the removal of all of our native plants and all of our native medicines that once existed in that place. And many of those things have been completely erased in true settler colonial fashion and replaced with tourism and big business and concretization of her home. So there's so many other things about Lahaina. It's such a rich historical place, but unfortunately what's happened because of settler colonialism in the past 130 years plus is people have come to know Lahaina as a tourist town. Before that, it was the sugar plantation town. Before that, it was a whalers town. And even in modern history, people still uphold, the narrative about this being this whaling town. And it was like such a fraction of time in our thousands of year history. But that's what gets promoted instead of our traditional Kanaka Maoli places, stories, people, and rich history.
Thanks so much for that wonderful sort of background information and context, because I think it really provides listeners and viewers with an idea that this is a place that, wasn't just a tourist site. It wasn't just a destination for American tourists or tourists from around the world to go and to sort of imbibe this idea of like a island culture or an idea of a resort town, that it's actually, there's deep historical significance and political claim to this territory. and it's resulted in the continual destruction, not only of Kanaka Maoli, like civilization, for lack of a better term. That's, like, let's be honest, like, that's kind of a contentious term there, but nonetheless, just the way that you were talking about the sort of the becoming sort of parallel or equal to so-called Western sovereigns by drafting constitutions and all these things. We do have to call these things for what they were. They sustained life. When I was in Molokai way back in the day, there I got a sort of interesting history of the islands. And one thing that always stuck out to me was that they were, not they, just people who were on Molokai, but Kanaka Maoli people were self-sustaining on this island. There's no imports, right? And the stat I was told, and I don't know how true this is, was that there was about 1 million or over 1 million native people who lived there, and they sustained themselves on the island, and also, of course, the sea itself. The islands are an extension of water in many ways. But today, because of the occupation, the destruction of the land, the repurposing of land for tourism, and for all this, the monoculture, all the things that you were naming, that a lot, I think it's a majority of the imports come from the outside, and that the water itself is becoming further and further depleted and contaminated. So it's not like, some people might say, oh, well, that's like a utopic thinking in the past. And it's like, well, at least you could drink a river. At least you could, you could get groundwater. And there was, the mode of relation was one not of extraction or profit seeking, but it was about sustainability. Of course there was conflict. Of course there was hierarchies. Of course there was struggle. Yeah, we all know that. That's a human society that's embedded, in the architecture and the things, in Lahaina, I'm sure. But it's a it's almost dehumanizing to say that, these are primitive cultures, or that, like, even the knowledge, or even saying that, like, this place has deities that need to be taken care of, is somehow like primitive and backwards thinking. Because look at what has happened in the absence of caring for those deities, and so there's been a lot of, I've seen things on the news, and there's some talk about, whether or not people should be praying to water, or if that's a good water policy, and it's completely missing the point, I think. And just exactly what you told me. And I just want to confess and apologize, if you will, accept my apology, that this feels like one of those moments where I see my family only at funerals when something bad happens, and then I learn what's going on in their lives, and I feel really bad for having this podcast interview when something bad has happened, when there's such a beautiful and rich history, and positive things that are going on, like that. I've learned so much from, like, my interactions and relations with Kanaka Maoli people, teaching us, in that connection. They were at Standing Rock, so there's such a beautiful connection between us as, Indigenous brothers and sisters in relations, that I just want to say that. I just want to put that out there, because I'm sure that you've gotten some crazy requests for interviews, and it's not comfortable to speak about. So I just really want to acknowledge that. My next question sort of relates to this, because you were talking about water, and I want to get to the question of water, but I actually want to talk about our relation to fire as well, because for us, our tribal name is Sichongu, which actually means burnt thigh, because we started a wildfire. We started a plane. It wasn't a wildfire because we started it, and it caught up to us, and we had to run through it, and so we burnt our legs. And that shows our relationship to fire. Fire isn't bad all the time. It's when it is magnified by these human, capitalist forces, that it becomes a force of destruction, something that we have bad relationship to. And I just wanted to maybe ask you if you have any perspectives on your relationship to fire.
Thank you for that. Fire, like any other natural element, like the wind, like the big rains, all of those things can be destructive when out of balance, which is why our people work so hard to be in balance with those things and create systems of sustainability that could manage those things. So we did have controlled burns. We used fire in a very responsible way to help, make ash to fertilize crops that were going to be growing there. We have mo'olelo about that. the fire is not the problem in and of itself. It's the mismanagement of the land. And as you were talking about, the capitalist, patriarchal commodification of sacred space that creates the conditions that allows this rageful fire to take hold and be so destructive and, so really horrific. But we would not have had this type of fire in this way had we not been, not we as in Kanaka Maoli, but the systems of oppression that are there, the settler government, because we are illegally occupied, as you mentioned, that created the conditions for this. So fire is never the issue. We are a people that live on volcanoes. The entire archipelago is volcanoes that has this very, very destructive but life-giving lava that is very, very hot that comes out of them. And for us, that is another ancestor, that is another deity, that is Tutupele. And when she comes, we clean house, we make room for her, and we get out of her way, because that is part of the cycle of life of death and rebirth and death and rebirth and death and rebirth of our land. And from that lava, our meakanu, our plants kipuka, they sprout through and the forest grows again. This is part of that cycle that we understand in our Hawaiian worldview and in our Kanaka Maoli cosmogony. So it's never about the element in and of itself. But I wanted to just touch on something you had mentioned before in your comments about, discussions about what is primitive and what is not. And I have this great uncle in our community named John Laimana, who teaches at one of the schools on Oahu. And he does this whole lecture about the myth of primitivism. And he talks about the timeline of Kanaka Maoli people being seafaring on our canoes, going back, I think the oldest data that we can confirm is something like 8,000 years ago for oceanic people, not specifically Kanaka Maoli, but oceanic people. And we did travel and we did trade, but it wasn't like, getting a shipment from mats and containers. But we had that technology. And when you put the timeline and then you look at Christopher Columbus's 1492, it's like, we're like all the way over here and Western civilization is right here. So reframing that whole ideology of primitivism, I think, is really important in this time, because it's language like that coming out of Western sciences and Western academia that fail to understand that Indigenous people already had it dialed in. We already knew how to be sustainable. And, we make up, 5% of the world's population, but we're catching the cracks for climate change more than any other group of peoples in the world. But we take care of the biodiversity of something like 80% of the world's biodiversity. So, we're not the primitive ones.
Yeah, I think about this too in terms of like relations. So you have the complex of telescopes atop Mauna Kea, and it's about mostly Westerners trying to find their relationship with the cosmos when they can't even respect the relationship of the land beneath their feet. And I was just in a conversation with not to go too far off topic, but I was in a conversation recently with some friends about UFOs and like extraterrestrial life. And I was like, how we're not even in correct relations with the planet we live on. How are we going to be in correct relations with, extraterrestrials? And I was thinking about that in terms of, the next question I have is with the question of water, because it is such a precious resource. When we say, water is life, it's not like, oh, us as Lakota people are somehow more in tune with water. It's like, try living without water for 2 or 3 days. You can't physically live without water. And so maybe expanding a little bit more on the sort of connections with water and why it's, you explained a little bit the historical and cultural connections, but like the contemporary connections, the like 30% of the world's like fresh water is used to water like golf courses. It's enough to end water shortages, throughout the world. But when your relations are those of private property and not of good relations with water and other people, that becomes your priority. How has that changed the landscape of not just Maui, but the all of the islands?
Yeah, thank you for that. You're right. It's about relationship. It's about right relationship. We call that pilina, our connection to something or someone. And our connection to vai, to water, was very, very tuned in and honed in. We sang to the water. We uplifted the water. We had a relationship with the water. We knew the water. And we changed the course of water so that it could flow from the top of the mountain through the ahupua'a, which is the land management system that goes from the top of the mountains to the sea, so that everybody could manage the resources and share equally, so that folks had the abundance that they needed. We created auwai, which would take the water from one place into the lo'ikalo, and then it would get all of those nutrients, feed the lo'ikalo, the kalo plants, and then it would go back down into the stream where it would meet at the mulivai, which is the combination between the freshwater and the saltwater, and it would feed the coral reefs. It would feed all of the fisheries that were nearshore fisheries or local fish ponds. And there was this very scientific, advanced way of moving water in a way that it could benefit us the greatest. And our people were brilliant. Kanaka Maoli people, Indigenous people are brilliant. And what's happened, Mauna Kahalavai, also called Mauna Ka'eke, and at the top of that is Ipu Kukui, and it's one of the second wettest places in the world. It has so much rainfall, and it's so lush. But if you get to the bottom of the Ahupua'a, it's totally dry. And the reason for that is the illegal overthrow by the Sugar Barons. The Committee of Safety turned into the 13 that overthrew our queen, and then basically stole the land on all of the islands so that they could produce more sugar and make more money. But the major consequence of that was the theft of the water, and they started diverting the water from one place on the island to a completely different side of the island in order to feed, like you were saying, hotels, swimming pools, golf courses, things that are not needs-based, right? Like water should be for our needs, to drink, to bathe, to grow food. But we have these other needs-based categories that get the bulk of the water. And we have hotels like Grand Wailea, who I believe is owned by Blackstone, not a friend to Indigenous people anywhere. They use something like, don't quote me on this, but it's something like 80 million gallons a day or something like that. They're the highest user of water on Maui, so that foreigners can come here for entertainment and recreation and be wowed by fake waterfalls and green golf courses and giant swimming pools, when right next to them you have Kanaka Maoli aunties and uncles living on the street with no more house, no more food, and no more water. And that's the piece that people forget, that those commodifications and those pieces of those industry, not only do they erase us, but they're literally killing our people. They're literally further displacing us from the land. Again, this happens over and over and over and over and over in our histories for all of us as Indigenous people. But that's what it looks like in Hawaii, is these gigantic hotels, golf courses, swimming pools, gentlemen's estates, mega mansions, people's second, third, fourth homes that sit with, giant swimming pools that nobody swims in except 2 or 3 days a year. Meanwhile, our people are unsheltered, starving, or if they do have shelter, they're working 3 or 4 jobs just so that they can pay their rent or their mortgage, because the average home price just went up to like $1.2 million on Maui, but the average salary is like $88,000. And most of the people I know don't even make $88,000. That's a lot of money. And most of our people aren't even close to that. So the disparity that has happened because of things like theft of water, because if the water was in the streams where it belonged, our kalo farmers could practice subsistence farming, which we've done for 1,000 years. They could feed their families even without a JOB job. They could provide. But we don't even have that opportunity because the water has been stolen and continues to be stolen by the offshoots of the sugar plantations and the unscrupulous developers who have purchased those water systems, like West Maui Land Company, Launiopoko Irrigation. It's all the same people. They build the homes, and then they own the water company that directly feeds those homes from our aquifers and from our streams.
And there's also reports of real estate agents cold calling Lahaina residents to essentially sell their property or their lands to these developers. And what's the response here? Because this is, some people are calling it disaster capitalism or plantation disaster capitalism in the context of Maui. And to quote unquote rebuild, a lot of, even here, like in places or in the United States, like the state or the mainland. I don't even like calling it the mainland, but
we call it the
here
continent.
In North America. Yeah, the continent. There you go. When something bad happens, like a flood or something like that, there's always this intense sort of rush to develop, and nobody ever asks, like whether or not this is like according to the needs of the actual people here. I was just curious, is there a group that's coalescing to sort of challenge the exploitation of this disaster and this catastrophe for these big developers?
Yeah, I'll tell you, every Kanaka Maoli who's done even a fraction of work around decolonization in their minds and work to shed some of the forced assimilation is ready for a fight. Like the whole community, all of Hawaii actually is like, ready with their go bag when they get the kahea, when they get the call, because we are not going to let that happen, like literally over our dead body, because, and even more literally over the bodies of our ohana who perished in that fire, which is a whole nother piece that disaster capitalist leaves out of the question is it even appropriate to build on top of this very, very hallowed ground that not only has the bones of our ancestors for 1,000 years, but has the bones and ashes of our ohana who perished on August 8th. And that is a serious question that we all have to ask when we talk about rebuilding, whatever that means. I think our Kanaka people, the people that I speak to, are very clear that Lahaina will not be rebuilt as a resort town, that we will look to our past. We have a saying, "Ika wā mā mua, ika wā mā hope." If you want to move forward, you must look to the past, because that's where the wisdom, the ike, and the lessons are. And that will help give us the vision to guide us forward. But that being said, I caretake a kupuna, an elder who lost his collection of artifacts and carvings in the fire, and he was devastated. But the next morning he had a dream or a vision overnight, and he woke up and he said, "I was dreaming of seeds. I'm dreaming that we're planting seeds in the ash, planting the seeds of our ulu and our kalo and our medicines, so that the next generation can have life." And we go back to this thinking before where we were talking about feeding. It's always about feeding in our culture. How can we feed? Because that's what gives us life and promotes life. So for this 85-year-old to have that kind of wisdom, I think many of us are holding on to that and looking at, when the time is right, how are we going to restore the waters? How are we going to get all that water from the mountain to come down and get back into our streams so that we can replant our lo'ikalo once that aina is safe to do so and determined to not be toxic? How are we going to restore mokuhinia, the wetlands, and all of the other wetlands along that shore that were filled in for American recreation, paved over for businesses, and for commodification culture? So there's many different groups. There is no one Hawaiian group, just like there's no one American group or one anything group, right? Like we work, we come together and we stand shoulder to shoulder when we need to. We all have different ways of looking at how to do that. But the important thing is that we're all at the table. And the important thing really is that it's at our own table, that we make our own table. And if those other guys are lucky, we'll let them come sit at it. I mean, really, that's the way this has to go down, because they will not, the settler government systems will not acquiesce. The master's tools can never dismantle the master's house. But we have the opportunity right now to show them a different way. We're showing the world a different way, that by having this, building these communities of care where we're taking care of one another, where we're meeting each other's needs. And, if the government wants to support us and throw us some funds, cool. But we don't need that. We have all made pilina and relationships in Hawaii and outside of Hawaii, and have gotten so much support. If we needed to do it without them, we could, because we did for 1,000 years. And that's the whole thing, that the settler ideology is to create systems of dependence on them instead of interdependence on the things that have always cared for us, like our aina and our vai and our kai, our ocean water. So yeah, we're ready. But the government is definitely making moves for a big development. I mean, even before the fires happened, my partner lives in Lahaina town, lost his house. And it was an very old family home, but the land goes back in the family like long before the house was ever there, for multiple generations. And when people say they're from Lahaina, they mean like they're from Lahaina, genealogically connected for generations. And I won't even say I'm from Lahaina because I wasn't raised there, but my genealogy goes back there 22 generations. So we have our sense of place based on all of these different factors and how close we are to a place. But they've had people approaching them for years, offering millions of dollars for their land. And they absolutely will not sell. They absolutely will not, because you can't get the land back once they take it like that, unless there's something catastrophic again. So land is everything for us, and land is the foundation of settler colonialism, right? They need to get the land. If they can get the land, then they can control everything else, and they can control us, and they can make us dependent on them through their capitalist system, because now we have to buy their goods and services because we're not able to do it anymore because they've stolen the land and the water. So the goal is always to get back the land, get back the water, and be in those right relationships with that, and rebuild those connections and remember those stories and those mo'olelo that our ancestors left for us.
Yeah, thanks for that. I want to shift gears a little bit, because you were talking about the settler government response and even, offering money. And I think of this as like on multiple levels. You have the local response, the state, the federal government, and then the question that I have for later is the military. That's always on the top of my mind, and especially when you think about Hawaii and the occupation. But can you just maybe briefly talk about there was the Maui Emergency Management Agency, who was led by a man named Herman Andaya, who was in many ways, I don't know how to best say this, but negligent, to put it mildly, incompetent, dangerously incompetent at his job, apparently. And what was the response like in terms of like the initial kind of like warnings that went out, and how was there, like, what was the failure? What went wrong, and what needed to happen?
There's so many things that went wrong, and I heard our mayor he gave an address to the people for the first time recently, and he said, we're not looking back yet, because we want to just get a grasp on the response. Of course, this is 3 weeks out already. He said, we will comply with a full investigation, but I do live on the other side, but there were no alert warnings that went out. So if there was a lot of people live in different places, but they work in Lahaina, and there should have been a mass message that went out to everybody, alerting them that this fire was happening. The emergency, what do you call those things that make the loud noise? The alarm, it's not called an alarm, but forgive me, I can't remember the name, but
it's like when they accidentally sent out an alarm that like North Korea was launching missiles,
yes,
or something like that.
Yes,
one.
Very traumatic. Well, so that came in through a text message, So we didn't have that, but then there are emergency sirens that we have on Maui. And in our state code, it states that they can be used for any number of emergency responses, including fires. But the county had a policy that they would only use it for tsunamis. And at least that's what they said in the aftermath. They since changed that policy because we had a fire a week and a half ago. Again, we've had 2 fires since on the Lahaina side that absolutely, terrified everybody and took them right back into that shock. But they sounded the sirens this time. I don't think they will ever not sound the sirens again. So that's a lesson learned. But I honestly can't even wrap my brain around how they didn't know what was going on enough to warn people in a like, even if it's only used for tsunamis, when you know that the fire is ravishing the whole town, push the button, like sound the alarm. It doesn't matter, if that's going to save people. And it's not even against the law. It's part of a law. So it's, that's a really hard question because there's so much that we don't know yet. And I'm not sure, I'm not trying to be a conspiracy theorist or anything like that, but I think they were just grossly underprepared. And our West Maui Councilwoman, Tamara Paulton, she's been saying this for years since she's been on the council, and she created a new committee called Disaster Resilience and Response because she was trying to be forward thinking. But I think what happens with a lot of bureaucrats, at least in our county, I don't know how it is where you are, but folks are really not that forward thinking. They're not looking at futures. They're not looking at multiple generations ahead. They're just trying to follow the rules and go by the book and deal with all the bureaucracy. And it's so problematic. And I think that's one reason our people get so upset and frustrated because, this isn't even our government. This is a settler government in an militarily occupied, independent kingdom of Hawaii with Indigenous people. And the settler government is relatively clueless. And, I don't mean to pick on them personally because this is a small community, and I know the family of Herman Nandaya. I don't know him personally, but I know his family and I know his kids, and I know this is going to be very hard for them. But why was somebody hired who really didn't have the qualifications in the first place? And that's what happens. We see a lot of nepotism in the county. It's good old boy politics. It's nothing new from where you folks are. It's good old boy politics where people put their friends into positions and they get political kudos and they get more votes, and then they hold the majority, and then we can't get anything done. And it's the same old process over and over and over again in our county government. And that's not to say all people. We have some fantastic kick-ass people, grassroots people who are trying to be in those seats, not because they just love the county and want to be part of it, but to do harm reduction and to make sure that our people are at the table and doing everything we can to make it as good as we possibly can while we're still under the settler system until such time that we can have our full ea and liberation realized in Hawaii. And that day is coming. I promise you that day is coming.
Well, I'll say the question about that for last, but I wanted to kind of explore this topic a little bit more because there's like this saying in the United States, I don't know if it's there, where it's like, oh, there's a cop in the neighborhood, meaning like the closer you live to a cop, like the safer the neighborhood is going to be. And in my mind, I think about Hawaii as like a place where there's a lot of military presence there. They do war games, almost annually. And they're, the idea is that they're there to protect ostensibly American interests, whatever that means, in the Pacific from a kind of great powers conflict coming from Asia. But yet the same institution is the largest human institution in the world. The largest human institution in the world is also the largest emitter of carbon and greenhouse gases in the world, contributing overrepresented in its contributions to climate change. At the same time, you have in Oahu the contamination of their water supply at Red Hill because of the leakage. And this isn't just like going after, like, again, we all drink water. It's like, this is like, they always try to tack it onto us. Oh, it's these primitives who are like, they're worried about the water. It's like, And it's like, no, there's this white lady who was like in a military family who's like, yeah, the water's contaminated. Like, and then they're like, no, we're not going to listen to you either. You know, you've gone native or something like that. But I wanted to, you know, like, what is like, I don't know if it's like, cause it's like, is there a jurisdictional thing? But you would think I don't know, what was there a response by the military, and like, is there a responsibility there in what happened, or what's, you know, the response to, you know, the emergency stuff that was happening, or the aid? Like, I haven't seen anything about it reported. And to me, it's just like, you know, it's in my mind because I know, you know, like the National Guard gets deployed sometimes. You know, the military will be sent out by executive order to provide aid or to do something, rebuild homes. I don't know. Is what's the benefit of having a cop in your neighborhood?
Yeah, we'd rather not. Thank you very much. You know, the cop in the neighborhood thing is like, you know, we still have a lot of folks here. Listen, this is nothing personal against our brothers and sisters who are in law enforcement, because people go into it for all different kinds of reasons. And there's a narrative that's spread across our community that you're going to, you know, serve the community in this role. And sometimes they do. But the foundation of law enforcement, the word police comes from the word polis, which takes us back to the state. And the job really at the end of the day is to protect the state. It's not just the state of Hawaii, but like the whole government state. And so whether they realize it or not, our local law enforcement is conditioned to uphold systems of oppression like patriarchy and capitalism, and protecting business, protecting the government before protecting the people. So we see this with our unsheltered community, who are continually criminalized just for existing. We see this with the prison industrial complex, where, you know, Black and brown and Asian people are certain Asian minorities like Micronesians, Samoans, Pacific Islanders are targeted in Hawaii, and you know, overpopulate the prisons on the continent where they're sent off to, like saguaro. The police, in my opinion, oftentimes do more harm than good in our communities. And, you know, I saw this the other day. I'm the co-founder of a group called Maui Medics Healers Hui. We were up at Mauna Kea for 8 months taking care of people, and now we're on the ground doing medical care and healing for our people. And we saw somebody who had a mental health crisis, and the law enforcement officer that showed up said, well, I guess we're going to have to take her away in handcuffs. And I thought, we've got at least 4 mental health providers right here. Let's de-escalate. Let's help her. Let's try a different way. And, you know, their thinking automatically is to just contain the situation by whatever means necessary. And it's so like fundamentally backwards to serving the community. And, you know, I know they think they're protecting everybody else, but really the people we need protection from is often them. And them meaning the police, and their bosses, the government, and their bosses, the US government and the military that holds up that government. So there's this whole chain reaction thing that happens. And we haven't seen a lot of military presence on the ground, with the exception of the National Guard, who is holding the borders of the burn area where folks can't go in right now. And I support that area being closed right now because it is very, very toxic. And Department of Health does not have the test yet. The EPA does not have the test results back. We really don't know. We assume there's arsenic and asbestos and lead and all kinds of other toxic chemicals that are dioxins that are cancer causing and, neurotoxic, that can affect us now, that can affect pregnant mamas, that can affect generations ahead. We just don't know yet. So National Guard is there at the moment. Although, if National Guard wasn't here, we could have just as easily put our own Kanaka warriors up and they would have done this. They could have done the same thing, right? Like we have our own security if we need it. But, the larger military presence, you mentioned Red Hill, which is just absolutely horrific. Again, water is for everybody, not just natives. But I think people think that as long as you can turn on your tap, that it doesn't affect you. But it's no, the Red Hill water goes into everybody's tap systems and it doesn't discriminate. It doesn't discriminate. It's but that's part of the myth.
That's why it's sacred.
Right.
Why exactly. Why is that a mystery?
But like I think people are so brainwashed, and the forced assimilation for Indigenous people, and then just the general American brainwashing to disconnect people from nature, where your water does come out of a tap, so you don't have to think about where it came from. Your food comes in packages at a grocery store, so you don't have to think about where it came from. That's all part of the overarching disconnect that Western culture imposed upon Indigenous people the world over. So, but the military, we have them still at Pohakuloa. Their lease is almost up, and they're already trying to, weasel their way to extend their leases. They were at Koho'olawe, and they bombed. Koho'olawe is a very sacred island that they bombed for military practice starting in World War II, and it didn't stop until our people, our kia'i, our warriors, male and female and mahu, went to Koho'olawe, and over the course of several years, the protests were able to stop the U.S. military. So it can be done. It wasn't easy, but it can be done. And we lost two very important warriors, Kimo Mitchell and, I can see his face and hear his singing. It'll come to me. I can't believe I can't remember his name right now, but just such amazing Aloha Aina warriors. And the saying was, ahiki ke aloha aina hope loa, until the last aloha aina, we will stay here and we will protect what we love until the very last one of us. But, the military in Hawaii, and of course the military was responsible for the initial coup. We had the Committee of Safety who banded together with the U.S. Navy, which made their actions possible. And President Cleveland retracted those actions and called it an act of war. But by the time those things were getting settled, McKinley was already in office and wanted the U.S. for wanted Hawaii for the Spanish-American War. So we have been in the middle of a military battle for a very long time, since the mid-1800s. And, we think back to Pearl Harbor, another military situation where my grandfather was working at Pearl Harbor and had to die for dead bodies and became very ill afterwards. And there's a whole cascade of effects that happened because of that trauma to my grandfather. But the thing is that Japan was not bombing Hawaii. Japan was bombing the United States. And had the United States not been in Hawaii, that would have looked very, very different, because we were allies with Japan. We were a kingdom before Japan was a kingdom. In fact, some of our royals were supposed to marry each other at one point, and we were very close allies. So when people project about, we need the U.S. to save us from these Asian countries, if the U.S. wasn't here, we have no idea what our relationship with China would be as the Hawaiian Kingdom. We were a neutral, sovereign nation, not unlike Sweden in terms of neutrality. So it's really like irresponsible and unfair to project that all the big bad guys of the world would attack Hawaii if America wasn't protecting us. Because the truth is, America's protection has cost us far more than it has benefited us.
Yeah, I was speaking with a friend and colleague. Her name is Sardana Nikolaev. She's from the Russian Federation, and she's Sahai from the Saha Republic. And I asked her kind of like a similar question about, being, part of the Russian Federation, being Indigenous, but then also being always dragged into these like great power conflicts. And she's like, we have to promote, as Indigenous people, we have to promote a politics of non-alignment, because it's always us who are at the bottom and are made more, like we're the first targets. Yeah. They didn't go to, I don't know, like, they didn't go to the suburbs of Cleveland and bombed. They bombed Hawaii. It was like the farthest colonial outpost, or one of the farthest colonial outposts in the Pacific. And we don't have a stake. We don't have a dog in that fight, so to speak. I don't know where these metaphors come from, but I'm just throwing them out there. But my final question sort of relates to what you were talking about. With the warriors who. And warrior, and I use that in a term that has no gender connotations whatsoever. But oftentimes in these moments of catastrophe or crisis, whether it's like they're trying to build a pipeline across our road or across our land, trying to construct another illegal telescope on top of a sacred mountain, or they're trying to turn an area into a bombing range, or there's a disaster that happens, like where I'm from, there was COVID-19, there's multiple blizzards that cut people off. People literally died in their homes because the state refused to plow roads because the snowpack was so thick. But people stepped up. Like, we have these internal mechanisms within our community. It's like one of the strongest remnants we have as Indigenous people is that connection. We still have warrior societies. We still have people who are accountable to community. People call it mutual aid. I'm sure every society has some kind of version of this, right? Like, people don't just stop being human in moments of catastrophe. In fact, they become more human. They become more social. And I always see seeds of, like, I guess you could call it like radical alternatives in these moments that come from, ostensibly mutual aid groups, but it's also a matter of like scaling it up to the project to essentially stop, the forces of destruction from, regaining control. So my question is two parts. One is, what does that look like in this context? And then in terms of a future, a decolonial future, anti-colonial future. And then also, what are the groups that our listeners should be supporting in this moment in time?
Thank you. Mahalo. First, let me say it was George Helm. That's whose name wouldn't pop into my head. But George Helm, we have to honor George Helm because he made that ultimate sacrifice. He was the lehua with Kimo Mitchell for Koho'olawe and lost his life fighting for our Aina. But, we have to do what George Helm said. He said, do your homework, do your homework, do your homework. And that means being educated about all the players, about the history, to the extent that we can be. We're all playing catch up because we had that whole forced assimilation thing. So we have to decolonize all of that old stuff. And as my kumu kaleko kaea says, pull the worms of decolonization out of our brains and constantly check our thoughts and make sure that what's in our brain is the truth and not something that was imposed upon us by Western ideology. So doing our homework is a big part of it. But when it comes to land back and looking at what is going to happen to Lahaina, I have to say, I personally feel that our spiritual connections and our pule to our akua and our deities is going to be a big part of that. Those deities were very political. We absolutely have to have the political analysis. We can't just rely on the prayer. But I think they're already speaking to us and telling us what they want. And I think one of the most Indigenous practices is listening to, whether you call it creator or I like to call it creation because it's always, vibrant and moving and changing. And, all of the akua, we have 40,000 akua that fall under that. It's really watching the signs and listening and letting them inform how we're going to move forward. We can strategize, we can absolutely plan and be as prepared as possible. But at the end of the day, they're going to move us through our na'au, which is that place below our belly button where we hear their voices and where they tell us where we need to go next. When sometimes we don't know why, but they tell us move here, move there, move here. I think what's happening is we're starting to get into sort of this collective place like that. And this is really my hope, is that we can sort of collectively tune into that as a first peoples. And then, at the center, at the pico, starting with the people from Lahaina in the middle, and then have our allies around us. And then, have our other Indigenous brothers and sisters from all over the world behind that. And then have anybody else who supports us about that behind us, in those outer circles, protecting us so that by the time it gets to the point when we need to say what we need to say, we have mass mobility and we have capacity and we have the ear of the world. And I want to thank you for having me on because since it has been very exhausting getting calls from media, but on the other hand, I feel like when do we have the opportunity to tell our stories? Like generally the rest of the world doesn't really care about our stories. They only care about hula dancers and mai tais and vacations and their own entertainment. They very rarely want to hear what Kanaka Maoli have to say. So not you folks, of course, but the larger media population. So even though it takes a lot of labor to do interviews and whatnot, it's really an opportunity for us to speak truth to power and to speak truth to our other Indigenous brothers and sisters and our allies and inspire people to rise up in our behalf and help us hold the government accountable. Help us hold the United States government accountable for the illegal overthrow. They already signed the Apology Bill in 1993. If you haven't read it, it's Act 103-150. You can Google it. You can just Google Hawaii Apology Bill. It's amazing. Like, it lays out the whole thing. It lays out everything that they did that was illegal. And then they leave it at that. They say sorry, but there's no reconciliation. There's no action steps. There's no, this is how we're going to return your country. This is how we're going to return your land. Of course, there's none of that. But, you know, we have the receipts. We have all the receipts. We don't have to prove to anybody anymore that this even happened, which for a long time was the case. People didn't even believe, our own people didn't even believe we had a kingdom because they were never taught that in school. I mean, it's just ridiculous, the Americana propaganda. So I think the piece of this is really important. That's really important is that allyship and people outside of Hawaii as well. You know, just leaning in, waiting to see what they can do. And we will let you know, believe me, we will let you know if there's a kahea, if we need you to come here or not. Sometimes it's better for us when folks don't come here. But, you know, hold our government, hold the US, hold your government if you're American. Hold your government accountable for its crimes against the Kanaka Maoli people in the Hawaiian Kingdom. Hold your government accountable. And think about that when they try to spread lies about the true history of Hawaii and their responsibility. We are not, you know, we are not there, what do they call us? There's a derogatory word that they call us, like we're their, I can't think of the word, but it's like when we need them, they're our provider, they're our caretaker. And we don't need them. We never needed them. We don't need to be rehabilitated. We need to be left alone. We need the US out of Hawaii yesterday. We can do it ourselves with our allies, with our relationships with other countries we built, and with the relationships that we're building right now with other Indigenous nations and other people across the world. Yeah.
And is there any organizations, if people want to support, that you want to uplift?
Definitely. The medical work that we're doing on the ground, you can go to Maui Medics Healers Hui.org, MAUIMEDICHEALERSHUI.org. Na'ai o Maui is the cultural center that burnt down in Lahaina, where our kupuna's collection went up. And they were such an important part of not only our cultural heritage, but our ku'e, our resistance. They did a lot of land back work. And the family that ran it themselves reclaimed land after 20 plus years in court with Peter Martin in West Maui Land, the unscrupulous developer who steals water. That is NAAIKANE.org. You can also check out Maui Rapid Response. I think it's MauiRapidResponse.org. And they have a list of organizations on there that you can donate to. And these are all organizations that are helping get care, goods, supplies directly to people on the ground in Maui.
And we'll drop the links to each of these organizations in the show notes or in the episode description. If you're listening or watching, you can check out more about how you can help. Noelani, this has been wonderful. Thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us. Wopila tanka from my heart to the the beautiful lands that I got to see. They'll live in my mind forever, permanently in my mind forever. I don't need to go back. Like it was, like it was just such a beautiful place. And it's not just like the landscape. It's not just a beach resort, it's the power, the mana that's there. And I was always moved by that. And, Hawaii will always be, close to my heart. So I thank you so much for taking the time and, just prayers and blessings to all of your comrades, your relatives on the ground, because you guys are really, out there. And so I just thank you so much.
Wopila mahalo. And you have an open invitation. If you'd like to come, please come anytime. Just reach out. We'd love to have you.